On my 33rd birthday, my adoptive parents invited me to an exclusive Chicago restaurant. I thought we were celebrating. Instead, my father slid legal severance papers across the tablecloth. My mother sipped her wine and told me the state's subsidies for keeping me had dried up, and I was no longer a useful asset to their public image. I did not shed a single tear. I just signaled the waiter drop their $4,000 dinner check onto my father's lap and smiled. I told them it was funny they brought up money considering I had found my biological family 6 months ago, and the billionaires who actually funded my entire existence were sitting exactly 3 tables behind them. When my mother turned around, the color completely drained from her face. My name is Cameron. I am 33 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful mergers and acquisitions consultant, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Chicago meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. From elementary school through high school, I maintained perfect grades and joined honor societies, hoping to earn a fraction of the affection my parents showered on my younger sister. It never worked. And tonight, the illusion of family was about to be permanently shattered. Le Petit was the kind of restaurant where the lighting was deliberately dim to hide the wrinkles of the aging socialites who frequented it. The air smelled of roasted truffles, expensive perfume, and desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a fast-moving world. I sat at a corner booth, the crushed velvet upholstery pressing against my back, watching the people who had legally adopted me 28 years ago. Richard Montgomery, the man I was supposed to call father, was busy swirling a glass of Cabernet that cost more than my first car. He owned a supply chain logistics company that he loved to brag about at country club mixers. Anyone with a basic understanding of corporate finance could see the glaring cracks in his empire, but Richard operated on pure ego. Beside him sat Patricia, a woman whose face was a testament to expensive cosmetic procedures and a complete lack of genuine emotion. She viewed everything in life as a transaction, a mere accessory to enhance her own public image. We were supposedly there to celebrate my birthday, but there were no gifts on the table, no warm wishes, and certainly no atmosphere of celebration. Instead, the tension was thick-layered with the kind of smug superiority they always displayed when they felt they held all the cards. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, my mind operating with the cold precision I utilized every single day in my career. My entire professional life revolves around analyzing failing businesses, identifying toxic liabilities, and executing ruthless takeovers. I know how to spot a sinking ship long before the captain even realizes the hull is breached. Looking at my adoptive parents tonight, I saw two people drowning in their own arrogance. The main course had just been cleared away when Richard cleared his throat. He did not offer a toast. He did not say a single word of affection. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the pristine white tablecloth, the heavy paper coming to a stop right next to my water glass. I looked down at it, recognizing the weight and texture of legal documents. I did not ask what it was. I simply picked up my knife, slid the blade under the flap, and opened it. Inside was a stack of papers filled with dense legal jargon. A declaration of severance. A formal, legally binding renunciation of my inheritance rights, effectively stripping me of any claim to the Montgomery estate. It was a contract designed to erase me completely from their financial and legal future. I looked up from the documents, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Patricia set her wine glass down, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across her carefully stretched features. "Happy 33rd birthday, Cameron," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that barely concealed her absolute venom. "Let us not pretend this is a celebration. We are all adults here, and it is time to be practical. The state subsidies and the tax write-offs we received for keeping you ended a very long time ago. You are no longer bringing any value to this household. In fact, you are a drain on this family's image. You do not fit into our social circles, you do not contribute to the Montgomery legacy, and frankly, you are just not useful to us anymore. Richard leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the table. He looked at me with the same detached calculation he used when firing warehouse employees. We have spoken to our attorneys, he added. The papers in front of you are standard. By signing them, you acknowledge that you have no legal standing to contest our will or claim any portion of my company. We gave you a roof over your head. We fed you. We fulfilled our legal obligation. But the charity ends tonight. You sign those papers, and we all walk away cleanly. If you refuse, I will have my corporate legal team bury you in litigation until you cannot afford to pay your own rent. Any other daughter might have broken down. Any other person might have cried, screamed, or begged for an explanation as to why 28 years of shared history meant absolutely nothing. But I felt nothing of the sort. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. Working in corporate acquisitions teaches you to separate emotion from strategy. When a toxic asset reveals its true nature, you do not mourn it. You leverage it. I looked at the documents again, scanning the clauses and the forged sense of superiority dripping from every paragraph. They genuinely believed they were in control. They believed they held the power because they thought of me as the quiet, obedient, adopted girl who should be grateful for scraps. They had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months conducting a forensic analysis of their entire existence. I thought back to the years of conditional love. The way Patricia would parade me around at charity galas when I was a child using my adoption as a prop to showcase her own supposed philanthropy. Behind closed doors, I was nothing more than an afterthought. When I needed basic things, Richard complained about the bills for months. When I wanted to apply to a prestigious private university, Patricia outright refused, claiming it was a waste of resources on someone who did not share their genetics. They forced me to take out massive student loans to attend a state school, saddling me with debt while they funneled astronomical sums of money into their biological daughter's account. They conditioned me to believe that my mere presence in their home was a debt I could never fully repay. Every meal, every piece of clothing, every basic necessity was cataloged in their minds as a grand gesture of their boundless generosity. Sitting here tonight, looking at the legal severance papers, the final illusion of family evaporated. This was just a business transaction concluding. The silence at the table was broken by the sound of a sharp, condescending laugh. It belonged to Brittany, the biological golden child of the Montgomery family. She sat adjacent to me, draped in designer fabrics that were paid for entirely by Richard's struggling company. Brittany had never worked a hard day in her life, floating from one expensive hobby to the next, fully supported by the bank of mom and dad. Beside her sat her husband, Jamal. He was an African-American man in his late 30s wearing a tailored suit and an oversized luxury watch that caught the dim restaurant light. Jamal was the current operations director at Richard's logistics firm, a title he had acquired purely through nepotism. He had zero qualifications for the role, no background in supply chain management, and a staggering incompetence that was actively destroying the company from the inside out. But because he pandered to Richard's ego and treated Brittany like royalty, his failures were continuously swept under the rug. Jamal leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey with a look of supreme arrogance. He loved joining in on the family sport of putting me down. It made him feel secure in his unearned position. "You really should just sign the papers, Cameron," Jamal said, his tone thick with mockery. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be. You have to understand how the real world works. Loyalty and legacy belong to the actual bloodline. Richard has built an empire, and empires need to be protected from outsiders trying to get a free ride." He chuckled, reaching into his pocket and tossing a heavy set of car keys onto the table. The unmistakable crest of a brand new Porsche gleamed under the chandelier. He pointed a finger at me. "In fact, you should probably go ahead and order an Uber right now. I would offer you a ride home, but family rides in luxury. Outsiders take the bus." Brittany giggled, leaning her head on Jamal's shoulder. "Jamal is right, Cameron. You always tried so hard to fit in, but it was honestly just sad to watch. You were a charity case. Mom and Dad did a nice thing taking you in, but you cannot seriously expect to get a piece of the family fortune. We are building a future here. Jamal and I have a lifestyle to maintain, and the company needs to stay within the true family. Just take whatever dignity you have left, sign the renunciation, and disappear quietly. I sat, completely motionless, absorbing their words. They were practically vibrating with self-satisfaction, utterly convinced of their own untouchable supremacy. Jamal was grinning proud of his brutal little speech. Brittany was looking at me like I was a piece of trash that had finally been swept out to the curb. Patricia was sipping her wine, watching my face for any sign of a breakdown. Richard was tapping his fingers on the table, waiting for me to pick up the pen and surrender. In the world of high-stakes corporate acquisitions, the greatest advantage you can ever possess is being underestimated by your opponent. When your adversary believes you are weak, they become sloppy. They expose their vulnerabilities. They hand you the knife and then expose their throat. Jamal tossing his Porsche keys was not a display of wealth to me. It was a glaring red flag of misallocated corporate funds. Brittany talking about maintaining her lifestyle was just confirmation of the financial bleeding happening behind the scenes. They thought they were intimidating me, but all they were doing was providing me with verbal confirmation of the financial crimes I had already uncovered. I did not feel humiliated. I felt an overwhelming icy calm, the kind of calm that settles over a predator right before it strikes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or launch into a passionate defense of my worth. Emotional outbursts are for people who lack leverage, and I had all the leverage. I calmly lifted my hand and made a subtle gesture to our waiter who had been hovering nervously near the edge of the dining room. He approached immediately carrying a black leather folder. The dinner check. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of who to hand it to given the intense atmosphere at the table. I reached out, took the folder from his hands, and opened it. The total was staggering. $4,250. They had ordered the most expensive champagne imported caviar and premium cuts of Wagyu beef, fully intending to gorge themselves while they kicked me out of the family. I closed the leather folder with a soft snap. With a fluid, deliberate motion, I tossed the checkbook across the table. It landed squarely on Richard's lap, spilling slightly open to reveal the exorbitant total. Richard glared at me, his face flushing with immediate anger. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper to avoid drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "You are going to pay for this dinner, Cameron. It is the least you can do after everything we have provided for you." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly into my adoptive father's eyes. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I am not paying for a single thing tonight, Richard," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "And I am certainly not signing those pathetic papers. You want to talk about funding my existence? You want to talk about outsiders taking a free ride? I think you should turn around." Patricia frowned, her wine glass halting halfway to her mouth. "What are you talking about?" I kept my eyes locked on Richard, but my words were for the entire table. "I found my biological family 6 months ago. The people who actually funded my entire life, the people whose money you have been stealing for over 2 decades, are sitting exactly 3 tables behind you." The smug satisfaction instantly vanished from Jamal's face. Brittany stopped giggling. Patricia slowly, hesitantly turned her head to look over her shoulder. Sitting at the VIP table near the back wall was Nathaniel Kensington. He wore a bespoke suit that cost more than Jamal's entire wardrobe, radiating the quiet, devastating power of old money. He did not look angry. He looked like a man about to squash a bug. As Patricia made eye contact with him, Nathaniel slowly raised his champagne glass in a mocking toast. When my adoptive mother turned back to face me, the color had completely drained from her face. The game was over and the real corporate takeover was about to begin. I reached across the table and placed my hand flat on the stack of certified bank statements Nathaniel had dropped. I slid them directly in front of Richard. I told him to look closely at the signature on the trust disbursement authorizations from 5 years ago. I pointed out how the loop on the letter in my name was completely wrong, a frantic imitation done by someone desperate for cash. I explained to the table that when the Kensington Trust documents arrived at their house shortly after my 18th birthday, they intercepted the mail. They realized a massive fortune had been deposited in my name. Instead of telling me Richard and Patricia spent months orchestrating a highly illegal scheme to forge my signature, set up a shadow account, and systematically drain $3 million over the course of 4 years. Patricia opened and closed her mouth, her forehead unable to crinkle in the panic she was clearly feeling. She stammered that I was insane and that they had never seen that money. I did not raise my voice. I simply listed the exact dates and amounts. I recounted how in October of that year, $400,000 was wired directly into the operating account of Montgomery Logistics to prevent a catastrophic payroll default. I looked at Brittany and told her the exact date, an $80,000 wire transfer cleared to pay for her luxury destination wedding in Cabo, followed by another massive withdrawal to purchase the very Porsche Jamal had tossed the keys to earlier. The color drained from Brittany's face as she realized her entire life of luxury was funded by the stolen inheritance of the sister she treated like garbage. Jamal abruptly stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor of the restaurant. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me and Nathaniel. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded I stop speaking immediately. He told Nathaniel to back away from his family table before he called the restaurant security and the police to have us both arrested for harassment and extortion. Jamal thought acting like the aggressive protector would secure his place in Richard's good graces. I did not even look up at him. I simply reached into my designer tote bag, pulled out a secondary red folder, and shoved it hard into Jamal's chest. He stumbled back a step, instinctively catching the file. I told Jamal to sit down and shut his mouth. I instructed him to open the folder and look at the internal financial audit of his own department. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. I informed him that as the operations director, his division had hemorrhaged $400,000 in the last quarter alone due to gross incompetence and catastrophic mismanagement of vendor contracts. I told him his six-figure salary, his tailored suits, and his luxury car were paid exclusively by the money his father-in-law had embezzled from my biological family. I leaned in and stated that he was not a successful executive. He was a parasite feeding off a stolen trust fund, and his complete lack of business acumen had accelerated the destruction of the company. Jamal's bravado vanished instantly. He sank back into his chair, dropping the folder onto the table, his eyes wide with utter humiliation. Seeing her husband silenced and her favorite son-in-law completely emasculated, Patricia panicked. She looked frantically around the restaurant, realizing that nearby tables of high society peers had fallen completely silent, eavesdropping on our conversation. Desperate to save face, Patricia tried to play the ultimate martyr card. She raised her voice, adopting a shrill, theatrical tone of victimization. She cried out that she had put a roof over my head, that she had fed me, clothed me, and raised me when my own people threw me away. She demanded gratitude, screaming that I owed her my life, and that bringing these vile accusations to a public dinner was the ultimate betrayal of a mother's love. I cut her off with a dialogue dagger so sharp it left the table breathless. I told her to stop using the word mother. I reminded her that when I was accepted into college, she forced me to take out $60,000 in high-interest student loans for a state school because she claimed the business was struggling and they could not spare a dime. I pointed right at her face and stated that while I was working double shifts at a campus cafeteria to pay for my textbooks, she was illegally funneling $200,000 of my own trust fund to pay for Brittany's extravagant wedding and European honeymoon. I told Patricia that stealing a child's future to fund biological favoritism is not parenting. It is embezzlement, and it is a federal crime that carries a mandatory prison sentence. Richard slammed his heavy fists onto the table, rattling the silverware and knocking over a crystal water glass. The spilled liquid pooled around his severance documents. He glared at me with pure hatred, completely abandoning the polished country club persona he had maintained for decades. He sneered that I was a foolish, ungrateful little girl who did not understand how the world operated. He boasted that his corporate lawyers were the best in Chicago, that his company was an untouchable pillar of the community, and that even if I tried to sue him, the money was already gone washed through a dozen corporate accounts. He claimed he would bury me in litigation until I was bankrupt and begging for mercy on the streets. I let out a genuine booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls of the restaurant. The sound completely unsettled him. I looked at Richard and finally revealed the truth about my career. I told him he had spent the last decade assuming I was some low-level data entry clerk because he never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. I stated clearly that I am a senior mergers and acquisitions consultant. I do not just read balance sheets. I dismantle entire corporations for a living. I spoke entirely in the ruthless financial terminology he claimed to master but fundamentally failed to understand. I broke down the exact math of his failure. I explained that to hide the massive holes in his operating budget, caused by Jamal's incompetence and Brittany's spending, Richard had been forced to take out massive high-interest commercial loans from a secondary financial institution. To secure that desperate capital, he had foolishly pledged 60% of his company's equity to the bank as collateral. Richard's face went rigid. His eyes darted nervously toward Nathaniel, the terrifying realization finally beginning to dawn on him. I continued, my voice merciless and steady. I detailed how the bank had quietly categorized his logistics company as toxic bad debt last month. I explained that when a company is bleeding cash and defaults on its covenants, the bank does not wait for a miraculous recovery. They put the loan up for private sale to recoup their losses quickly. Richard tried to interrupt, stammering that he was currently in the middle of renegotiating the terms with the loan officers and that everything was strictly under control. Nathaniel did not say a word. He simply reached into his impeccably tailored suit, produced a final heavy legal binder, and slid it directly over the spilled water on the table. The embossed gold letters on the cover read, Kensington Private Equity Group. I watched Richard's eyes track the letters. I told my adoptive father that the bank did not renegotiate his terms. Instead, they sold his bad debt for pennies on the dollar to a private equity firm that specializes in hostile takeovers. I smiled as I told him that the Kensington Private Equity Group had purchased his entire debt portfolio 48 hours ago. I leaned across the table, invading his personal space, bringing my face mere inches from his sweating forehead. I delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that starting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am the new majority shareholder of Montgomery Logistics. I own his office building. I own his entire trucking fleet. I own his vendor contracts. And most importantly, I own him. The horror that dawned on Richard's face was a masterpiece of human devastation. The arrogant patriarch, who had spent 28 years treating me like an unwanted liability, suddenly realized that his adopted daughter had not just exposed his theft. I had legally, systematically, and ruthlessly orchestrated the hostile takeover of his entire life's work. He could not speak. His mouth hung open as his brain short-circuited under the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. I did not give them a single second to recover. As the new owner of the company, I dictated my very first executive orders right there at the dinner table. I stated that I was freezing all company expense accounts immediately. I looked directly at Patricia and Brittany, watching the blood drain from their faces as I informed them that the corporate credit cards currently sitting in their designer purses would be declined the next time they tried to purchase so much as a cup of coffee. I told them their fake stolen wealth was officially cut off at the knees. The Montgomery family empire was dead, and I was the one holding the smoking gun. Nathaniel Kensington stood up from his table. The ambient chatter of Le Petit seemed to hush as he navigated through the dimly lit dining room. He did not rush. Every step he took was measured, exuding the kind of absolute authority that cannot be bought or faked. There was no tearful family reunion here, no dramatic embraces or emotional outbursts suitable for a daytime television show. Nathaniel approached our booth with the chilling focus of a corporate executioner delivering a fatal verdict. Patricia stared at him, her mouth slightly open, the expensive vintage wine trembling violently in her manicured hand. Richard tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project dominance, but he looked incredibly small and suddenly very frail in the shadow of true power. Nathaniel reached the edge of our table. He did not introduce himself pleasantly. He did not offer his hand to the man who had legally adopted me. Instead, he reached inside his tailored charcoal jacket, pulled out a thick leather-bound stack of certified bank statements, and dropped them directly onto Patricia's porcelain plate. The heavy documents landed with a dull, hard thud right on top of her half-eaten Wagyu beef, splattering a drop of dark, rich sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth. Richard jumped slightly in his seat, his face flushing a volatile shade of dark red. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with a volatile mixture of outrage and sheer panic. "You cannot just walk up to my table and throw garbage into my wife's dinner. I demand you leave immediately before I call the manager." Nathaniel looked down at him, his expression completely blank, his eyes devoid of any warmth or mercy. "I am the man whose family has spent the last 2 decades tearing apart the corrupt bureaucratic closed adoption system of this state to find our missing sister," Nathaniel said. His voice was a low, commanding baritone that required absolutely no volume to be utterly terrifying. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, a sound that resembled a dying animal. She looked around the restaurant, frantically terrified that her wealthy friends at the neighboring tables were listening to the sudden unraveling of her social standing. Brittany sat frozen in her chair, her eyes darting wildly between me and Nathaniel, her brain struggling to process the situation. Jamal shrunk back into the upholstery, his previous arrogance entirely extinguished by the overwhelming presence of a man who could likely buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. Nathaniel kept his gaze fixed on my adoptive parents, his posture rigid and commanding. Due to a catastrophic clerical error in the late 80s, Cameron was lost in the system, misfiled under a different registry. My parents spent millions trying to track down the child that was taken from us. They hired the best private investigators in the country, navigated endless legal red tape, and exhausted every possible resource to correct the mistake the state had made. When our investigators finally located her 5 years ago, my parents were overjoyed. But they were also meticulous. They wanted to ensure she was completely secure before making contact, knowing she was living with people of highly questionable character. Richard swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming at his temple and rolling down his cheek. He tried to muster his usual bluster, but his voice lacked its arrogant, biting edge. "This is absurd," Richard stammered, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We never received any notification about anything. I have no idea what you are talking about. You are harassing us, you are making wild accusations without proof, and I will not tolerate it for another second." He lied effortlessly, a reflex born of years spent deceiving his investors, his employees, and his own family. But Nathaniel just smiled, a cold, predatory curve of his lips. He tapped a long, elegant finger against the stack of documents sitting in Patricia's dinner. "We did not just set up a reunion," Nathaniel continued, his voice slicing through Richard's pathetic defense. "We established an irrevocable trust fund in her name, a $3 million trust fund. We sent the formal legal notifications directly to this household, assuming her adoptive parents would act with basic human decency and inform her of her massive inheritance. We assumed you would hand over the documentation and allow her to access the capital that rightfully belonged to her. We assumed wrong." The number hung in the heavy air of the restaurant. $3 million. It was more liquid cash than the Montgomery family had ever seen at one single time. Brittany let out a sharp intake of breath, her eyes widening as the magnitude of the wealth registered in her materialistic brain. Nathaniel turned his attention to Patricia, leaning down slightly to ensure she heard every single syllable. "My family trusted you to do the bare minimum as legal guardians. We trusted you to hand a piece of mail to your adult daughter. Instead, you intercepted those documents. You saw a fortune that did not belong to you, and you decided to play a very dangerous game with people who possess infinitely more resources than you could ever comprehend." Patricia opened and closed her mouth, her forehead unable to crinkle in the panic she was clearly feeling due to her extensive cosmetic procedures. "We never," she started, her voice shaking violently. "We never saw any money. Cameron has always been provided for. We gave her a wonderful life." The silence that followed was absolute. The background noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away completely as the Montgomery family stared at the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. They had thought they were untouchable. They had thought they could sever my adoption, kick me to the curb, and walk away with their stolen wealth intact. They were wrong. The trap had closed the steel jaws, snapping shut around their ankles, and there was absolutely no escape. I watched Richard's eyes dart across the top document, his breathing turning shallow and rapid, as he recognized the damning paper trail he thought he had successfully buried. He looked at Patricia silently, searching for an alibi that simply did not exist. The fake empire they had built on the foundation of my stolen inheritance was crumbling right before their eyes, and I was going to enjoy watching every single brick fall. I tapped the heavy stack of certified bank statements, forcing Richard to look at my index finger resting directly over his fraudulent wire transfers. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. I explained to the table exactly how they executed their pathetic scheme. Patricia used her connections at her elite country club to find a corrupt notary public, someone willing to look the other way, and rubber stamp a signature that clearly did not match my driver's license. From there, Richard established a shell corporation named Montgomery Holdings. It was a phantom entity designed for one single purpose: to wash the Kensington Trust money, before quietly injecting it into his failing logistics firm. They thought they were financial masterminds operating a flawless money laundering scheme right under the nose of the adopted daughter they viewed as utterly clueless. I kept my eyes locked on Richard as I systematically dismantled his facade of a successful self-made man. I told him I had traced every single dollar down to the cent. 5 years ago, his supply chain logistics company was a rotting corporate carcass. He had lost his two biggest national freight contracts due to staggering operational inefficiencies and his own massive ego. He was weeks away from missing a critical payroll cycle and being forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The Kensington Trust Fund did not just buy him a new boat, it acted as an illegal life support system for a business that deserved to die a natural death in the free market. I pointed to a specific line item on the top page highlighting a transfer of $400,000 dated October 12th. I stated that this exact amount was wired directly into his corporate operating account to prevent a catastrophic default that would have triggered an immediate federal investigation. He did not save his company through hard work or strategic pivoting. He saved it by robbing a young woman of her birthright. Richard opened his mouth to deny it, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He just stared at the undeniable numerical proof of his federal crimes, his chest heaving as the air seemed to thin out around him. I then turned my attention to Patricia, whose face was currently paralyzed in a mask of absolute horror. I told her that she was just as guilty, if not substantially worse. While Richard used my stolen inheritance to patch the gaping holes in his sinking corporate ship, she treated my trust fund like her own personal slush fund. I stated that she utilized the stolen capital to finance her biological daughter's lavish, unearned lifestyle, desperate to maintain the illusion that the Montgomery family was thriving. I shifted my gaze to Brittany. The golden child was trembling, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table as if the floor might suddenly open up and swallow her whole. I told her I knew exactly how her picture-perfect life was financed. I leaned forward and listed the stolen expenses with cold surgical precision. The $80,000 destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas, complete with flown-in exotic floral arrangements and a top-tier photography crew. The massive down payment on the 5-bedroom suburban mansion she currently lived in, a house she loved to brag about to her socialite friends, despite neither she nor her husband having the credit score to actually secure a mortgage on their own. The constant influx of designer handbags, the luxury ski trips to Aspen, the weekly spa days. I told Brittany that every single ounce of her supposedly elite lifestyle was bought and paid for with my stolen money. She was not a successful, independent woman. She was a direct beneficiary of grand larceny. Brittany gasped, a high-pitched, panicked sound escaping her throat. She looked frantically at Patricia, silently begging her mother to deny it, to tell her this was all a vicious, fabricated lie meant to ruin her evening. But Patricia just looked away, staring blankly at the spilled sauce on the white tablecloth. The crushing silence from her parents was the ultimate confirmation. Brittany physically shrank in her seat, the arrogant posture she had carried all night completely shattered. I did not stop there. The surgical strike was not yet complete. I moved my gaze to Jamal. He had sunk back into the velvet upholstery of the booth, his previous arrogance entirely extinguished by the crushing weight of reality. I pointed a steady accusatory finger at the silver car keys still resting near his half-empty glass of expensive whiskey. I told Jamal to look at his keys. I stated that on March 14th of last year, a wire transfer of $140,000 was sent from the Montgomery Holdings shell account directly to an exotic auto dealership in downtown Chicago. I asked him if he remembered what he bought that day. I asked him if he remembered posting a picture of himself leaning against the hood of a brand new Porsche, captioning it with a ridiculous quote about hard work, dedication, and the daily grind. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against the stiff collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He could not speak. The crushing realization that his entire identity as a successful, wealthy executive was a complete fabrication had paralyzed him. I told Jamal that he did not earn that car. He did not hustle for it, and he certainly did not buy it with his unearned salary. I stated that he was driving a vehicle purchased with stolen trust funds, which legally made him an accessory after the fact to wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. I watched his dark eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as the legal implications of my words finally registered in his brain. He was sitting at a table with people who had just implicated him in a multi-million-dollar federal financial crime. The reality of what a federal judge would do to him was settling heavily onto his broad shoulders. I sat back in my chair, allowing the absolute devastation of my words to fully permeate the table. I looked at the four people who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwanted burden, like a charity case who should be forever grateful for the crumbs falling from their table. I had just laid bare the complete, undeniable truth of their existence. Their wealth was fake. Their superiority was a delusion. Their entire empire was built on a foundation of severe criminal activity, and I was the one holding the match. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, but it did not last. Denial is a powerful drug, and for someone like Jamal, whose entire ego was wrapped up in an unearned executive title and a stolen luxury vehicle, reality was simply too painful to accept. The initial shock that had paralyzed him moments ago suddenly mutated into volatile defensive anger. He could not handle the fact that his wife was looking at him with terror instead of admiration. He could not stomach the reality that he was entirely dependent on a massive financial crime to maintain his lavish lifestyle. So he did what incompetent men always do when they are backed into a corner and stripped of their leverage. He tried to rely on brute physical intimidation. Jamal pushed his chair back with a violent screech against the polished floorboards. He stood up to his full height, towering over the dining table. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his broad frame to cast a threatening shadow over me and Nathaniel. He slammed his large hands down on the white tablecloth, rattling the silver cutlery and knocking over a crystal salt shaker. His face contorted into a mask of aggressive manufactured outrage, completely abandoning the sophisticated executive persona he had been trying to project all evening. "Listen to me very carefully, Cameron." Jamal growled, his voice rising in volume, no longer caring who in the exclusive restaurant heard him. "I am not going to sit here and let you disrespect my family. I do not care what forged bank statements your new rich friend printed out in his office. You are not going to come into a place like this, interrupt our private dinner, and throw around wild accusations of embezzlement. This is harassment. This is straight-up extortion, and I am putting a stop to it right now." He turned his aggressive posture toward Nathaniel, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at the billionaire's face. "And you. I do not care how much old money you think you have. You do not just walk up to Richard Montgomery's table and threaten him. I am giving you exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk out the front door. If you do not leave right now, I am calling restaurant security to physically drag you out. Then I am calling the Chicago police to have you both arrested for disturbing the peace and attempting to blackmail a legitimate business owner." Jamal looked incredibly proud of himself after delivering his ultimatum. He glanced quickly at Brittany, clearly expecting her to look at him like a conquering hero. He thought his little display of aggressive protector syndrome would somehow magically erase the federal crimes laid out in black and white on the table. He thought raising his voice would make the undeniable financial facts disappear. Nathaniel did not even blink. He did not shift his weight, nor did he break eye contact with Jamal. He simply looked at my brother-in-law with the mild annoyance of a man observing a loud, misbehaving dog. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne, entirely unbothered by the empty threats. I remained seated for a moment, letting Jamal's hollow words hang in the air. I looked at his clenched jaw, his tense shoulders, and the desperate sweating fear hiding just behind his aggressive glare. In the corporate world, empty threats are always the loudest. The people who actually have the power to destroy you never need to raise their voices. They just hand you the paperwork. I slowly stood up from the velvet booth. I did not match his aggressive energy. I did not yell. I simply reached down into my structured designer tote bag. My fingers bypassed the primary audit files and closed around a secondary bright red folder I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I pulled it out and stepped around the edge of the table, closing the distance between me and Jamal until we were standing face to face. Jamal tried to maintain his intimidating stance, but his eyes darted nervously to the red folder in my hands. Without a single word of warning, I shoved the heavy file directly into the center of his chest. The sharp impact forced him to instinctively bring his hands up to catch it, causing him to stumble backward half a step and completely break his aggressive posture. "Sit down, Jamal!" I commanded, my voice dropping to a terrifying, authoritative register that echoed the exact tone I used when dismantling fraudulent executives in boardrooms. I did not yell, but the absolute certainty in my voice left no room for debate. "You are in no position to call security, and you are certainly in no position to protect a family that is about to face federal indictment." He stood frozen, clutching the red folder against his tailored suit, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock. I kept my eyes locked on his, stripping away every ounce of his unearned pride. I told him to look inside the folder. I informed him that as the operations director of Montgomery Logistics, he was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. I stated with cold mathematical precision that his specific division had hemorrhaged $400,000 in the last quarter alone. I broke down his catastrophic mismanagement right there in the dining room. I elaborated on the contents of the red folder, telling him that page 4 detailed the $50,000 in compliance fines his department incurred because he forgot to file standard interstate transport permits. I mentioned page 7, which highlighted the absurd logistics routing errors that cost the company thousands of gallons of wasted diesel fuel every single week just because he refused to upgrade the tracking software. "You are not a businessman, Jamal," I said, my words slicing through his fragile ego like a scalpel. "You are a massive, bleeding liability. Your entire career is a charade. Your six-figure salary, your custom suits, and that brand-new luxury car are paid exclusively by the money your father-in-law stole from my trust fund. You are not protecting an empire. You are actively bankrupting a company that was already surviving on stolen cash." I took a step closer, ensuring my next words would haunt him for the rest of his life. I reminded him that in the real world of corporate finance operations, directors who lose $400,000 in a single quarter are terminated immediately and escorted out of the building by security. The only reason he still had a keycard was because he was married to the boss's daughter. I told him that if he called the police, the very first thing I would hand them was the detailed financial audit proving his complicity in receiving stolen funds. I asked him how his aggressive protector routine would hold up in a federal penitentiary. Jamal stared at me, the blood draining entirely from his face. The aggressive looming figure from a minute ago had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified man realizing his entire life was built on a trap door that I had just unlatched. His hands began to shake visibly, the red folder trembling against his chest. He looked at Richard silently, begging his father-in-law to contradict my numbers to assure him the company was safe. But Richard just stared at the table, utterly defeated and unable to meet his gaze. Without another word, Jamal slowly backed away from me. His knees seemed to give out, and he collapsed heavily back into his dining chair. The heavy thud of his defeat echoed in the quiet restaurant. He placed the red folder on the table as if it were a live explosive, his hands retreating quickly to his lap. He sat there pale and completely silent, staring blankly at the white tablecloth. His bravado was dead. The aggressive protector had been entirely neutralized by cold, hard data. As I took my seat back next to Nathaniel, the Montgomery family realized they had absolutely nowhere left to run. Seeing her husband silenced and her favorite son-in-law completely emasculated, Patricia finally panicked. The grim reality of the situation crashed through her expensive cosmetic facade. Her carefully constructed social image, built over 3 decades of country club luncheons and charity galas, was disintegrating in real time. She looked frantically around the restaurant. The nearby tables of high society peers had fallen completely silent, their expensive meals forgotten, as they eagerly eavesdropped on our conversation. Desperate to save face and control the narrative, Patricia resorted to the only weapon she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She tried to play the ultimate martyr. Patricia stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the polished floor. She raised her voice, adopting a shrill, theatrical tone of victimization designed specifically to garner sympathy from the wealthy onlookers. She threw her hands in the air and cried out that she had sacrificed her best years for me. She declared to the entire room that she had put a roof over my head, that she had fed me, clothed me, and raised me when my own people threw me away like unwanted garbage. She demanded public gratitude, screaming that I owed her my very life, and that bringing these vile accusations to a public dinner was the ultimate betrayal of a mother's selfless love. She sobbed a dry, tearless performance, asking the audience how a daughter could be so incredibly cruel to the benevolent woman who rescued her from the foster system. I did not shrink back from her public spectacle. I let her finish her pathetic performance, allowing her shrill voice to echo off the vaulted ceilings of the restaurant. I let the silence hang for a moment, ensuring she felt the full weight of the room watching her. Then I cut her off with a dialogue dagger so sharp it left the entire table breathless. I stood up slowly, matching her height but radiating a lethal, absolute composure. I told her to stop using the word mother. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single patron in the dining room heard the precise, devastating truth. I looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the facts. You forced me to take out $60,000 in high-interest student loans for a state school because you claimed the business was struggling and you could not spare a single dime. I pointed a steady accusatory finger right at her face, maintaining unwavering eye contact. While I was working double shifts at a campus cafeteria just to afford my textbooks, you illegally funneled $200,000 of my own trust fund to pay for Brittany's lavish destination wedding. I did not let her interject or try to spin the narrative. I listed the details of her theft so the entire restaurant could hear the exact depth of her depravity. I mentioned the custom ice sculptures, the flown in exotic floral arrangements, the private charter flights to Cabo San Lucas, and the endless open bar that she bragged about to her friends for months. I stated clearly that she financed her biological daughter's entire fairy tale life by deliberately stealing the financial security my biological parents had left for me. I leaned across the table, my voice dropping to a terrifying icy register. Embezzlement is not parenting, Patricia. It is a federal crime. Patricia gasped, staggering backward as if I had physically struck her across the face. Her theatrical sobbing ceased instantly, replaced by genuine, suffocating terror. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables began to whisper among themselves the scandalous details of her financial crimes, now public knowledge among her peers. The carefully curated reputation she valued above human life was officially dead slaughtered by the undeniable truth. I continued, relentlessly dismantling her entire identity piece by piece. I reminded her of the countless times she called me a burden, a charity case, and a financial drain on the family. I told her that every single meal she ever claimed to graciously provide for me was actually paid for by my own money. Every piece of clothing, every medical bill, every basic necessity was covered by the state subsidies she collected, and later by the millions she siphoned from the Kensington Trust. She never spent a single penny of her own wealth on me. She used me as a highly profitable tax write-off and a convenient prop to secure her standing on local charity boards. I reminded her that federal investigators do not care about her prestigious country club memberships or her fake social standing. I explained that wire fraud, identity theft, and the misappropriation of an irrevocable trust fund carry mandatory federal prison sentences. I told her she would not be trading her designer dresses for a slap on the wrist or a quiet settlement. She would be trading them for a standard-issue jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to tremble violently. She reached out toward Richard, silently begging him to defend her, to tell me to stop, to deploy his expensive corporate lawyers to silence me. But Richard was still paralyzed in his seat, staring blankly at the Kensington private equity binder that outlined his own imminent corporate destruction. He had absolutely nothing left to offer her. Patricia was entirely alone. The realization hit her with the catastrophic force of a freight train. Her husband was financially ruined. Her son-in-law was exposed as an incompetent fraud. Her biological daughter was hyperventilating over the loss of her stolen lifestyle. And the adopted daughter she had abused and underestimated for nearly 3 decades was now the corporate executioner, holding the absolute power to send them all to prison. Patricia slowly sank back into her chair, her face completely ashen. She looked down at her shaking hands, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the restaurant. The martyr had been crucified by her own financial records. The absolute destruction of the Montgomery family was unfolding exactly according to my strategic design. But just as Patricia's theatrical sobbing subsided into genuine despair, Richard finally snapped out of his paralysis. His ego battered and bruised by the overwhelming display of power radiating from Nathaniel and me, desperately sought a lifeline. Richard could not accept that the girl he had emotionally starved for nearly 3 decades was now holding the executioner's axe over his precious empire. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control, and his brain simply rejected the harsh reality of his current vulnerability. Richard slammed both of his heavy fists down onto the table with terrifying force. The sudden violent impact sent silverware clattering to the floor and shattered a crystal wine glass, spilling dark red liquid across the remaining legal documents. He completely abandoned the polished, sophisticated country club persona he had spent decades cultivating. His face twisted into a mask of feral rage, veins bulging visibly against his thick neck. He leaned aggressively over the spilled wine, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you can come in here and threaten me with some printed bank statements?" Richard snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat that reverberated through our private corner of the restaurant. "You think because you found some rich stranger to stand behind you, you can suddenly dismantle my life? You are delusional, Cameron. You are a naive, ungrateful little girl playing a high-stakes game you do not even begin to comprehend." He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to project the false dominance of a cornered animal. "I am Richard Montgomery. My logistics company is a foundational pillar of the Chicago business community. I employ hundreds of people. I play golf with judges, state senators, and bank presidents. If you even try to bring these forged, ridiculous accusations to a courtroom, I will unleash an army of corporate litigators that will bury you so deep in legal fees you will not see daylight until you are 60. I will sue you for defamation, extortion, and corporate espionage. I will ruin whatever pathetic little life you have managed to scrape together." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, genuinely believing his own fabricated superiority. "And as for the money, you are a fool if you think you can touch a single cent of it. That $3 million is gone, Cameron. It was washed through a dozen different corporate entities offshore, holding companies, and blind trusts years ago. It is completely untraceable. You cannot recover what no longer exists. You have absolutely no proof that tying those funds to my company operations will hold up in a federal court. You brought a piece of paper to a gunfight. He looked at Nathaniel, entirely dismissing the billionaire's silent, looming presence. You think you are the first rich guy to try and muscle me out? I eat corporate sharks for breakfast. The money is untouchable, the company is secure, and this little dramatic performance of yours is completely meaningless. Richard then turned his vitriol back to me, his eyes dripping with absolute contempt. You sit there in your cheap suit thinking you have outsmarted the master. You are nothing but a low-level data entry clerk who watched too many legal dramas on television. You push papers across a desk for $40,000 a year and think you understand how the global supply chain operates. You are completely out of your depth, Cameron. You are swimming with sharks, and you are about to get ripped to shreds. Now pick up your folders, take your new friend, and get out of my sight before I destroy you. I sat perfectly still, letting his tirade hang in the heavy air of the dining room. I let him expend every last ounce of his manufactured bravado. I watched the spit fly from his mouth, the sweat bead on his forehead, and the frantic energy vibrating through his body. He was grasping at straws, relying on intimidation tactics that only worked on terrified subordinates and spineless executives like Jamal. When he finally finished his rant, chest heaving with exertion, the silence returned. And then I broke it. I threw my head back and let out a genuine echoing laugh. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a deep, resonant sound of absolute predatory amusement that bounced off the mahogany walls and chilled the blood of everyone sitting at the table. Jamal flinched. Brittany stared at me like I was a psychopath. Patricia covered her mouth, realizing instantly that Richard's threats had zero effect on me. Richard's face contorted in confusion. "What is so damn funny?" he barked, slamming his hand on the table one more time. I stopped laughing, but the dangerous smile remained fixed on my face. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, entirely unbothered by the spilled wine creeping toward my sleeves. I looked directly into his panicked eyes, stripping away the last remaining layer of his delusion. "You really have absolutely no idea who I am, do you, Richard?" I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal cadence. "You spent the last decade assuming I was some low-level administrative assistant because you were too arrogant and too self-absorbed to ever ask your adopted daughter what she actually did for a living. You assumed I pushed papers because it fit your narrative of my utter mediocrity." I paused, letting the suspense suffocate him. "I am not a data entry clerk, Richard. I am a senior mergers and acquisitions consultant. I work for one of the most ruthless financial advisory firms on the planet. I do not just read balance sheets. I dismantle entire corporations for a living. I spend 50 hours a week executing hostile takeovers, identifying toxic assets, and liquidating companies run by incompetent, fraudulent executives exactly like you." I leaned back in the velvet booth, steepling my fingers. It was time to break down the math for them, not with anger, but with the cold, undeniable precision of financial reality. I told Richard that he had made a fatal error in assuming I lacked the intellect or the resources to understand exactly how he operated his business. I explained that in the world of high finance, a sudden influx of $3 million does not just sit idly in a bank account. It has to go somewhere, and it has to be accounted for. I detailed how after Richard illegally drained my trust fund to save his failing logistics firm, he realized he had a massive problem. The stolen money kept the company afloat for a while, covering payroll and masking Jamal's catastrophic operational failures. But a logistics company is a capital-intensive beast, and Richard's underlying business model was fundamentally broken. The $3 million was a temporary band-aid on a gaping, bleeding wound. Eventually, the cash ran out, and Richard was right back where he started, staring down the barrel of imminent bankruptcy. But this time, he had an added layer of terror. If his company collapsed, the subsequent bankruptcy proceedings would trigger a mandatory deep-dive forensic audit by federal regulators. Those auditors would scrutinize every single transaction over the past 5 years. They would inevitably trace the initial injection of $3 million back to the forged trust fund documents, exposing the embezzlement and sending both Richard and Patricia to federal prison. I watched Richard's face as I laid out his entire desperate strategy. I told him I knew exactly what he did next. Terrified of the looming federal audit, Richard scrambled to secure legitimate corporate funding to replace the stolen cash and prop up the illusion of a profitable business. He approached several top-tier financial institutions, but his credit was garbage and his operational metrics were a complete disaster. The major banks laughed him out of their offices, so I continued my voice steady and relentless. You turned to the secondary market. You went to a predatory commercial lender specializing in high-risk, high-interest corporate debt. You were desperate, Richard. You needed cash immediately to keep the lights on and keep the auditors at bay. And because you had absolutely zero bargaining power, you agreed to terms that were essentially financial suicide. I spelled out the exact terms of his catastrophic loan. He had secured a massive line of credit, but the interest rate was extortionate, designed to bleed the company dry over time. And worse, to secure that desperate capital, Richard had to provide substantial collateral. He didn't just pledge the company's physical assets. He pledged his ownership stake. I stated clearly that Richard had signed over 60% of Montgomery Logistics' equity to the bank. Richard tried to interrupt again, his voice cracking. That is a standard mezzanine financing structure. It is a temporary measure until we secure our next round of vendor contracts. You do not understand how corporate leverage works. I did not let him derail the narrative. I told him I understood leverage better than anyone at the table. I explained that by pledging 60% of his equity, Richard had effectively handed control of his entire life's work to a predatory lender. He was no longer the master of his own destiny. He was a tenant in his own company, existing entirely at the mercy of a bank that cared only about its quarterly returns. I pointed out that Richard's plan might have worked if Jamal wasn't actively destroying the company's profitability. But with the operations director losing $400,000 a quarter, Montgomery Logistics could barely cover the exorbitant interest payments on the loan, let alone pay down the principal. Richard was trapped in a death spiral of debt, frantically trying to outrun the consequences of his initial embezzlement. I looked at Patricia, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. I told her that her husband hadn't just stolen from me. He had mortgaged their entire future to cover his tracks. The lavish lifestyle she thought they possessed was a complete illusion built entirely on high-interest commercial debt and stolen trust funds. They were living in a financial house of cards, and a single gust of wind was all it would take to bring the entire structure crashing down. I turned back to Richard. The trap had been set years ago, not by me, but by his own arrogance and greed. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had successfully buried his crimes under layers of corporate bureaucracy. But in the world of mergers and acquisitions, there is always a paper trail. There is always a balance sheet that doesn't add up. And there is always someone willing to dig deep enough to uncover the truth. I told Richard that I had spent the last 6 months analyzing every single aspect of his business. I had reviewed his public filings, scrutinized his vendor contracts, and mapped out the complex web of shell companies he used to funnel the stolen money. I had identified the exact moment he pledged his equity to the secondary lender. I had seen the vulnerability he thought he had hidden so carefully. And then I explained. I waited. I watched as his company slowly suffocated under the weight of its own debt. I monitored the financial markets, tracking the status of his high-interest commercial loan. I knew that it was only a matter of time before he inevitably defaulted on his strict financial covenants. I leaned forward, making sure he felt the full weight of his impending doom. I told Richard that he hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had handed me the blueprint for his own destruction. And tonight, I was finally executing the plan. I told Richard that exactly 32 days ago, the compliance officers at his commercial bank ran a routine quarterly stress test on his corporate accounts. They looked at the catastrophic cash burn rate engineered by his golden son-in-law and realized that Montgomery Logistics had officially breached 3 separate, highly restrictive financial covenants. In the ruthless world of commercial banking, a covenant breach is an absolute death sentence. The bank immediately downgraded his massive corporate loan from a performing asset to a toxic high-risk liability. They knew that forcing him into immediate bankruptcy would be a lengthy, expensive public spectacle, resulting in them recovering pennies on the dollar after months of messy legal liquidation. Banks despise bad press, and they hate waiting for their capital even more. So they did exactly what elite financial institutions always do with rotting portfolios. They packaged his entire massive debt obligation and quietly shopped it around on the private distressed debt market. They aggressively sought a shadow buyer willing to take the massive risk off their hands in exchange for a steep immediate discount. Richard let out a sharp, derisive snort. He actually smiled, a sickening display of unwarranted confidence returning to his flushed, sweating face. He reached up, adjusting his expensive silk tie, as if preparing to confidently school a subordinate in a boardroom. He told me that my supposed intelligence gathering was embarrassingly outdated and entirely incorrect. He boasted loudly that he had personally sat down with the senior loan officers at his bank just last Tuesday. He proudly announced to the table that they had a highly productive working lunch, and he was currently in the final delicate stages of renegotiating his interest rates and extending the maturation date of his massive commercial loan. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He called me a foolish amateur, claiming that a minor, temporary liquidity crisis was nothing more than a standard operational hurdle for a legacy chief executive officer like himself. He insisted the bank was fully committed to working with him because his company was a cornerstone of the regional supply chain and simply too big to fail. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system, totally convinced his arrogant charm had secured his financial salvation. I let him finish his triumphant, pathetic little speech. I did not interrupt his delusions, nor did I raise my voice to correct his fundamentally flawed understanding of corporate banking. I simply turned my head and looked directly at Nathaniel Kensington. Nathaniel had been sitting in immaculate silence, observing Richard's frantic ego defense with the mild, detached fascination of a scientist examining a doomed insect trapped in a jar. He did not offer a malicious grin or a dramatic theatrical monologue. He moved with the terrifying absolute stillness of true generational power. Nathaniel reached onto the empty leather chair beside him and picked up a thick black legal binder. The cover was entirely devoid of any flashy corporate branding, bearing only the subtle, deeply embossed silver crest of the Kensington Private Equity Group. Nathaniel placed his large hand flat on the heavy binder and pushed it smoothly across the spilled vintage wine and the ruined white tablecloth. It slid with a heavy, ominous sound, coming to a dead stop right next to the original legal severance papers Richard had tried to force upon me at the beginning of the dinner. I looked back at my adoptive father, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper that commanded the absolute attention of the entire dining room. I told Richard that the bank officers he met with last Tuesday were indeed very polite professionals. I explained that they happily paid for his expensive steak lunch, nodded sympathetically at his desperate restructuring proposals, and shook his hand warmly on his way out the door. But they were never under any circumstances going to renegotiate his terms. I explained that commercial banks do not send their senior officers to salvage a sinking ship. They only took that lunch meeting to keep him completely docile, distracted, and entirely unaware while their back-office compliance team finalized the immediate wholesale offloading of his entire financial existence. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the heavy black binder sitting in front of him. I stated with absolute surgical precision that exactly 48 hours ago, the bank officially executed the private off-market sale of his entire debt portfolio. Because his company was bleeding cash so heavily and his operations director was a certified undeniable liability, the bank was desperate to clear the toxic asset from their books before the quarter ended. They sold his massive crushing debt obligation for a mere 20 cents on the dollar. I leaned across the table, ensuring the brutal reality of his total annihilation pierced directly through his arrogant skull. I told him the shadow buyer was not some faceless offshore hedge fund looking for a quick flip. The buyer who swooped in and purchased every single cent of his debt, acquiring the absolute legal rights to the 60% equity he had so foolishly pledged as collateral, was sitting right in front of him. I told him that the Kensington Private Equity Group had bought his entire life. Richard's smug, triumphant smile vanished instantly, as if it had been violently wiped from his face by a physical blow. His eyes darted frantically from my face to Nathaniel, then down to the black binder, sitting like an active explosive device on his dinner table. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He reached out with a trembling, hesitant hand, his fingers hovering for an agonizing second, before flipping open the heavy leather cover of the binder. The very first page was a certified deed of assignment and transfer of debt, bearing the official notarized stamp of his commercial bank and the signature of the very same loan officer who had smiled in his face at lunch last Tuesday. Patricia let out a soft, horrified whimper, her hands flying to her throat as she finally understood that her husband's bravado was nothing more than the dying breath of a conquered man. Brittany covered her mouth with both trembling hands, tears of pure, selfish terror welling in her eyes as the catastrophic reality of her impending poverty crashed down upon her shoulders. Jamal stared blankly ahead at the wall, completely and utterly broken. I sat back against the crushed velvet booth, watching the mighty Richard Montgomery suffocate under the crushing weight of his own unparalleled hubris. I did not allow the suffocating silence to stretch into comfort. The air in the private dining room was thick with their collective terror, but I refused to give them a single moment to breathe. I placed my hands flat on the white tablecloth directly next to the spilled Cabernet and the legal severance documents they had so arrogantly tried to force upon me just an hour ago. I leaned forward, bringing my face mere inches from Richard's pale, sweating features. He was shaking a barely perceptible tremor that started in his hands and radiated through his entire body. I locked my eyes onto his, ensuring he could not look away from the architect of his absolute destruction. Starting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am the majority shareholder of Montgomery Logistics, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I own the commercial lease on your corporate headquarters. I own every single truck in your nationwide delivery fleet. I own your distribution centers, your vendor contracts, and your intellectual property. And because of the toxic, highly leveraged debt you so foolishly signed your name to, I own you. The horror that dawned on Richard's face was an absolute masterpiece of human devastation. The arrogant patriarch who had spent 28 years treating me like an unwanted liability, a financial burden, and a shameful family secret, suddenly realized the fatal magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation. His eyes widened, searching my face for any sign of a bluff, any hint of hesitation or mercy. He found absolutely nothing. I was a blank corporate slate, entirely devoid of the familial affection he had so systematically beaten out of me. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He was physically incapable of vocalizing the magnitude of his defeat. He was watching his entire life's work, the business empire he had built, and subsequently driven into the ground through his own massive ego and sheer incompetence, being ripped from his grasp by the adopted daughter he had deemed utterly useless. I had not just exposed his theft. I had legally, systematically, and ruthlessly orchestrated the hostile takeover of his entire existence. You thought you were cutting me off. I continued, my words striking him like physical blows. You brought me to an expensive restaurant to discard me, fully intending to return to your fraudulent, stolen lifestyle while I figured out how to survive. But you failed to realize that while you were busy playing country club executive, I was operating in the real world of high finance. I was tracking the exact maturation dates of your commercial loans. I was monitoring the catastrophic failure of your operations department. I handed over a complete forensic dossier to Kensington Private Equity, and they acquired your toxic debt specifically to transfer the controlling voting rights directly to me. Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, ragged wheeze. You cannot do this, he gasped, his chest heaving as if he were physically suffocating. It is my company. I built it from the ground up. You have no legal right to just step in and take everything. I smiled, a cold, shark-like expression that offered zero comfort. I have every legal right, Richard. It is all explicitly outlined in the covenant breach clauses of the loan you signed when you were desperately trying to cover up your embezzlement of my trust fund. You pledged 60% of your equity as collateral. You defaulted on your liquidity ratios 3 weeks ago. By the strict definition of corporate law, the company ceased being yours the moment you missed your required cash reserve benchmarks. I am simply executing the transfer of assets. I sat back in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my tailored suit jacket, projecting the effortless dominance of a true corporate executive. I decided to outline his schedule for the next 24 hours, ensuring he understood the sheer speed and velocity of his impending doom. At exactly 8:15 tomorrow morning, I am convening an emergency meeting of the board of directors, I told him, speaking with brisk professional efficiency. Since I now control the majority voting bloc, I will be passing a unilateral motion to immediately terminate you as the Chief Executive Officer of Montgomery Logistics. You will be removed from the board entirely. You are being stripped of your title, your corner office, your company car, and your corporate expense accounts. Richard grabbed the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to anchor himself to a reality that no longer existed. He looked at Patricia silently, begging his wife to intervene to deploy some kind of social manipulation to stop the bleeding. But Patricia was completely catatonic. She was staring at the Kensington legal binder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her elite social standing was dead, her wealth was a mirage, and she was entirely powerless to save him. "You do not even need to show up to the office to pack your things," I added, twisting the knife just a fraction of an inch deeper. "I have already dispatched a private corporate security team to the headquarters. Your building access keycards have been deactivated. The security guards have specific instructions to box up your personal items and courier them to your home address. If you attempt to set foot on company property, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." The air rushed out of Richard's lungs in a long, defeated exhale. He slumped forward, his heavy shoulders dropping as the final pillar of his false empire crumbled into dust. He had brought severance papers to dinner, fully intending to erase me from his family and his fortune. Instead, he had walked blindly into an airtight corporate execution. I had taken his company, his title, his dignity, and his leverage, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the impending threat of a federal investigation. The transition of power was complete, and it was entirely non-negotiable. I allowed the crushing reality of Richard's total defeat to settle over the table for a few precious seconds before I pivoted my attention. Richard was a broken man, staring blankly at the white tablecloth, his breathing shallow and rapid. But my corporate restructuring was not quite finished. A hostile takeover requires severing every single unauthorized financial artery, bleeding the company dry. And the two most toxic liabilities were sitting directly across from me, clutching their designer handbags in absolute terror. I turned my gaze toward Patricia and Brittany. They both flinched simultaneously, pressing their backs against the plush velvet upholstery of the restaurant booth. They looked like two frightened animals, realizing the protective fence had just been ripped down. The arrogant high society sneers they had worn all evening were gone. I kept my voice incredibly calm, maintaining the absolute authority of a chief executive officer addressing a room full of terminated liabilities. I informed them that my very first official act, as the new majority shareholder of Montgomery Logistics, was to execute a comprehensive immediate freeze on all corporate expense accounts. Patricia's hands began to shake violently. She gripped her crystal water glass, the ice clinking loudly against the rim. I watched her trying to process the legal terminology, her brain struggling to translate corporate finance into how it affected her daily life. I leaned across the table, my eyes locking onto the heavy gold clasp of her expensive leather purse. I told Patricia that the black corporate credit card currently sitting inside her wallet was officially dead plastic. I explained that I had authorized the bank to deactivate every single secondary card linked to the Montgomery business accounts exactly 10 minutes ago. Brittany let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, her fingers clutching the delicate fabric of her designer blouse. She looked at Jamal, silently pleading for her husband to contradict me, to tell her this was a massive misunderstanding. But Jamal was still paralyzed, staring at the red audit folder I had shoved into his chest earlier. He had no comfort to offer her. I looked directly at my golden child sister and delivered the brutal, undeniable truth. I told Brittany that her limitless shopping sprees, her luxury spa memberships, and her weekly fine dining excursions were permanently canceled. The infinite well of stolen trust fund money she had been drinking from was officially capped with solid concrete. "You cannot do that," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking with fear and denial. "Those accounts are tied to our personal household management. We use those cards for groceries, for gas, for our medical copays. You are leaving us with absolutely nothing. We will not even be able to pay the valet to get our car back tonight." I smiled, a cold, shark-like expression that offered zero sympathy. I corrected her fundamentally flawed understanding of corporate law. I stated that using a commercial business account for personal household management is the textbook definition of corporate fraud. I reminded her that the funds she used to fill the tank of her luxury SUV were siphoned directly from my stolen inheritance. I told her that she was not a victim of sudden poverty. She was a beneficiary of grand larceny who was finally being cut off from the illicit supply chain. The Montgomerys' fake wealth was officially amputated at the knees. A thorough corporate cleansing requires dismantling every single fraudulent perk. I turned my attention back to Richard, forcing him to lift his defeated head. I informed him that the freeze extended to all company assets currently in his physical possession. I told him the luxury town car parked outside the one he claimed was an essential executive vehicle was a leased corporate asset. I stated that the leasing company had already been notified of his termination, and the vehicle was scheduled for immediate repossession tomorrow morning. I suggested he enjoy the ride home tonight because starting tomorrow the former logistics king of Chicago would be navigating the public transit system. Brittany began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved as the catastrophic reality of her new, impoverished existence crashed down upon her narrow shoulders. She pointed a trembling finger at me, tears of pure, selfish terror streaming down her heavily contoured cheeks. "What about my house?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "The mortgage payments are automatically drafted from the company accounts. You cannot stop those payments. We will lose the house. We will be out on the street." I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely no trace of the familial affection she had spent 28 years actively destroying. I told her with surgical precision that I had already canceled the automated clearinghouse transfers. I explained that a commercial logistics firm has absolutely no legal obligation to pay the residential mortgage of a terminated operations director and his unemployed wife. I leaned forward, ensuring my words pierced directly through her panic. I told Brittany she had exactly 30 days to figure out how to pay her own bills with her own earned money, or she could start packing her designer clothes into cardboard boxes before the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. The private dining room at Le Petit felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out through the ventilation system. The Montgomery family sat in a state of absolute collective ruin. They had walked into this restaurant expecting to effortlessly discard me like a piece of unwanted trash, fully intending to return to their stolen, luxurious lives without a single backward glance. Instead, I had systematically stripped them of their company, their titles, their vehicles, and their entire financial foundation in under 20 minutes. Patricia buried her face in her trembling hands, a quiet, defeated sob escaping her lips. The meticulously crafted facade of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch was completely annihilated. She was nothing more than a desperate, exposed fraud, realizing the bill for her decades of cruelty had finally come due. Richard remained motionless, his eyes glazed over in a state of profound psychological shock. He was a general who had just lost his entire army, his fortress and his treasury in a single devastating tactical strike. I sat back in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my tailored suit jacket. I looked at the four shattered people sitting across the ruined table. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted, locked down, and sealed in an impenetrable vault of legal and financial superiority. They were entirely at my mercy, and I had brought absolutely none with me tonight. The hostile takeover of the Montgomery Empire was flawlessly executed, and their reign of stolen privilege was permanently over. The absolute finality of my statement hung heavily in the air, smothering the remaining breath out of Richard and Patricia. But in the ruthless ecosystem of corporate survival, loyalty is always the very first casualty of a sinking ship. I watched the realization wash over Jamal's face. The paralyzing terror that had gripped him just moments ago began to mutate into desperate, cowardly calculation. He looked at his father-in-law, seeing nothing but a bankrupt, defeated old man staring blankly at a ruined tablecloth. He looked at his wife, who was currently weeping into her hands, completely stripped of her golden child armor. Jamal realized with sudden chilling clarity that the Montgomery family was no longer a protective shield. They were a heavy iron anchor tied directly to his neck, and they were dragging him down into the dark abyss of a federal prison cell. Jamal physically shifted his dining chair away from Brittany. The movement was sharp and deliberate, severing the physical solidarity he had maintained with her all evening. He sat up straighter, adjusting the lapels of his custom suit, frantically trying to salvage whatever shred of executive presence he thought he still possessed. He cleared his throat, a harsh, dry sound that drew the immediate attention of everyone at the table. He did not look at his weeping wife. He did not look at the broken man who had handed him a six-figure career on a silver platter. He looked directly at me. Cameron Jamal started, his voice adopting a sickeningly smooth, placating tone that made my stomach turn. Let us look at this logically. You are a businesswoman. I am a businessman. We both understand that in any major corporate transition, preserving operational continuity is absolutely vital for future profitability. Brittany snapped her head up, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. Jamal, what are you doing? She demanded, her voice trembling with the first hint of betrayal. Jamal completely ignored her, keeping his desperate wide eyes locked firmly onto mine. He leaned forward across the table, attempting to project the image of a reasonable corporate insider willing to make a highly strategic deal. You know the logistics firm is a massive, complex beast. He continued, speaking rapidly to prevent me from cutting him off. You need someone on the inside who actually understands the daily routing software, the complicated vendor contracts, and the warehouse deployment schedules. You need a dedicated transition manager to ensure the supply chain does not completely collapse tomorrow morning. I tilted my head slightly, observing him with the detached analytical fascination of a predator watching its prey willingly step onto a landmine. Go on, I said softly, giving him exactly enough rope to hang himself completely. Jamal took my quiet response as a massive sign of weakness, a glimmer of hope that he could actually manipulate his way out of a federal indictment. He threw his hands up in a gesture of total surrender, leaning eagerly across the spilled vintage wine. I will give you absolutely everything, Cameron. I will give you complete, unrestricted access to all the shadow ledgers. I know exactly how Richard was cooking the books to hide his tracks. He forced me to sign off on those inflated vendor contracts to hide the missing trust fund money. I was just following direct orders from the chief executive officer. I have digital copies of the internal emails saved on a private encrypted server. I kept them because I knew he was running this company straight into the ground, and I needed to legally protect myself. Richard let out a raw, strangled gasp of pure agonizing betrayal. He stared at his son-in-law with wide, bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving violently. You spineless, ungrateful coward, Richard hissed, his voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate treason. I gave you absolutely everything. I pulled you out of obscurity and made you an executive. Jamal sneered at the broken patriarch, showing his true opportunistic colors to the entire restaurant. You used me as a convenient human shield for your massive embezzlement scheme, Richard. You set me up to take the ultimate fall for your catastrophic operational deficits. I am not going down with your sinking ship. Jamal immediately turned his attention back to me, clasping his hands together in a pathetic display of begging, disguised as a high-level business negotiation. I can be your star witness, Cameron. I will testify against him in federal court under oath. I will hand the government auditors everything they need to secure a massive wire fraud conviction on a silver platter. I will help you legally liquidate his remaining hidden assets. In exchange, I just need full legal immunity. I keep my title as operations director. I keep my current six-figure salary. And we sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement protecting me from any civil liability regarding the missing trust funds. It is a massive win for both of us. You get the ultimate flawless revenge, and you secure the internal operations of your newly acquired company. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She lunged across her seat, grabbing Jamal violently by the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit. "You are abandoning us!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls and drawing the shocked, appalled stares of the entire high society dining room. "My parents bought you that luxury watch. They bought you that Porsche you love so much. You are throwing my father to the police just to save your own pathetic job." Jamal violently yanked his arm out of her grasp, shoving her hand away with a look of absolute unvarnished disgust. "Your father is a criminal, Brittany. Your entire lavish life is a complete fraud, and I am not going to a federal penitentiary because your greedy family decided to steal millions of dollars from an orphaned child. We are officially done." The ultimate betrayal was complete. The Montgomery family had officially cannibalized itself right in front of my eyes. Jamal sat back in his chair, breathing heavily, looking at me with expectant, desperate eyes. He truly believed he had just executed a brilliant corporate survival maneuver. He thought he had outsmarted his corrupt in-laws and secured his own untouchable future by offering me the absolute keys to Richard's destruction. I looked at Jamal, feeling a wave of utter profound disgust wash over my entire body. He was a coward, a traitor, and a staggering incompetent who lacked even the most basic understanding of loyalty or corporate leverage. He had absolutely nothing of value to offer me, and his spineless betrayal only confirmed that he was the single most toxic asset currently sitting at this table. "I don't negotiate with parasites," I said, my voice slicing through the dining room with glacial, unforgiving precision. Jamal's expectant, desperate smile froze instantly. His eyes darted frantically as the brutal reality of my rejection crashed directly into his calculating brain. "You actually think you have an ounce of leverage here, Jamal?" I continued, systematically stripping away his last shred of dignity. "I already own the logistics company. I already possess the certified bank records, the wire transfer receipts, and the comprehensive forensic audits. I do not need your hidden cowardly emails, and I certainly do not need a completely incompetent operations director who manages to lose $400,000 in a single fiscal quarter." I stood up slowly, looking down at his terrified, sweating face, exerting the ultimate authority of a true corporate owner. "You are fired, effective immediately. You will place your corporate cell phone, your company laptop, and the keys to that leased Porsche on this table right now. And you better hire a spectacular defense attorney, Jamal. Expect a forensic audit on your department by Friday." The heavy silver keys to the Porsche dropped onto the white tablecloth with a pathetic, hollow clatter. Jamal's trembling hand slowly retreated, leaving the corporate smartphone and his company laptop bag resting beside the spilled vintage wine. He did not say another word. He did not try to defend his shattered pride or beg for a second chance. The terrifying reality of a federal investigation had completely neutralized his hollow bravado. He slumped back into his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling, effectively removing himself from the battlefield. With Jamal completely neutralized, the absolute weight of the impending financial apocalypse crashed squarely onto Brittany's shoulders. For 28 years, my biological sister had floated through existence on a soft, luxurious cloud of stolen money and unearned privilege. She had never been told no. She had never been forced to face the consequences of her own actions. She had been groomed by Richard and Patricia to believe she was untouchable, superior, and universally adored. But looking at the surrendered car keys and the frozen corporate credit cards, the golden child finally understood that gravity had come to collect its massive debt. Brittany's perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps, her chest heaving under her expensive silk blouse. She looked at Richard desperately, waiting for her invincible father to produce a miracle to loudly declare that this was all a terrible nightmare and that her lavish lifestyle was perfectly secure. But Richard was still staring at the Kensington legal binder, an empty hollow shell of a defeated patriarch. When she realized her father was completely powerless, Brittany violently pivoted her attention to Patricia. The panic mutated instantly into a feral, vicious rage. "You promised me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the hushed, elite atmosphere of the restaurant like a jagged piece of glass. She did not care about the wealthy socialites watching from the neighboring tables. She did not care about maintaining the sophisticated Montgomery image. She was a spoiled child having a massive public temper tantrum because her stolen toys were being confiscated. "You promised me the money was completely safe. You looked me in the eye and told me Cameron was just a pathetic, useless placeholder we could easily throw away. You said my trust fund was secure forever." Patricia's eyes darted frantically around the dining room, her face burning with the ultimate social humiliation. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab Brittany's arm to pull her back down into the velvet booth. "Brittany, please," Patricia whispered harshly, her voice tight with absolute panic. "Keep your voice down right now. Everyone is staring at us. We will figure this out at home. Please just sit down and be quiet." "Do not tell me to be quiet," Brittany screamed violently, ripping her arm out of her mother's weak grasp. She did not just pull away, she leaned forward and physically shoved Patricia hard in the chest. The impact caught Patricia entirely off guard. She stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the polished floorboards, and slammed heavily into the edge of the dining table. The remaining crystal glasses rattled violently, and a sharp gasp echoed from the surrounding patrons. In the world of high society, maintaining composure is the ultimate currency. Physical violence at a Michelin-starred restaurant was the absolute undeniable proof that the Montgomery family was nothing more than high-class trash. "I am going to lose my house," Brittany wailed, completely ignoring her mother's physical shock. "My mortgage payment is due on the 1st of the month. My personal credit cards are completely maxed out. I have zero savings because you told me the company would always cover my expenses. You told me I never had to worry about earning my own money. You absolutely ruined my life." The family imploded in real time right in front of my eyes. There was absolutely no loyalty here. There was no unconditional love, no foundational bond forged through years of shared history. They were nothing more than rats trapped on a rapidly sinking ship, violently cannibalizing each other in a desperate, futile attempt to stay above water. The moment the stolen money evaporated, their entire familial structure collapsed into a pathetic display of primal selfishness. Patricia reached out again, tears of supreme humiliation streaming down her heavily powdered cheeks. She tried to project a motherly warmth she did not actually possess, attempting to soothe the monster she had personally created. "Sweetheart, please listen to me," Patricia begged, stepping toward her frantic daughter with open arms. "We are still a family. We will find a way to survive this horrible situation. I am your mother, and I will always protect you." Brittany reacted with absolute visceral disgust. As Patricia reached out to embrace her, the golden child swung her hand back and violently slapped her mother's arms away. The loud, sharp smack of skin hitting skin echoed perfectly through the silent dining room. "Do not touch me!" Brittany spat, her face twisted with pure venom. "You are not a protector. You are a stupid, arrogant criminal who got caught. You and Dad stole millions of dollars and you were too incompetent to even hide the money properly. You dragged me into your pathetic embezzlement scheme and now I am the one who is going to end up bankrupt and living on the street. I absolutely hate you. I wish I had never been born into this pathetic, fraudulent family." Patricia stood completely frozen, clutching her stinging wrist against her chest. The words struck her with the devastating force of a physical execution. The daughter she had worshipped, the biological child she had illegally funded by actively destroying my life, had just publicly disowned her in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. Patricia had spent 28 years trying to make me feel like a worthless outsider, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively raising a vicious, ungrateful parasite who would instantly turn on her the second the cash flow stopped. I sat back in my chair watching the spectacle unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. The elite patrons of Le Petit were completely captivated by the catastrophic destruction of the Montgomery dynasty. Whispers rippled through the dining room as wealthy socialites eagerly documented the public downfall of the arrogant couple who had spent decades parading their fake wealth around the country club. The facade of the perfect wealthy family was shattered publicly and irreparably. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to intervene or offer a single word of comfort. I was a corporate surgeon observing the final fatal spasms of a terminal disease I had successfully excised. The Montgomery family was bleeding out on the floor of a luxury restaurant entirely by their own design. They had sown the seeds of their own destruction decades ago when they decided greed was more valuable than basic human decency. Now the bitter harvest had finally arrived. I looked at Nathaniel, who simply nodded his silent approval. The surgical strike was performing flawlessly. The utter collapse was spectacular. I shifted my gaze from the weeping remnants of my adoptive mother to the surrounding tables. The exquisite dining room, usually a sanctuary of discreet wealth, had transformed into an amphitheater of high society judgment. These were not random tourists. These were the elite power brokers of Chicago. I recognized the president of the Regional Commerce Board sitting 2 tables away, his fork resting motionless on his plate. I saw the wives of Richard's country club partners, leaning in close to one another, their eyes wide, lips moving rapidly as they digested the lucrative gossip unfolding in front of them. In the brutal hierarchy of the upper-class, blood in the water attracts sharks instantly. And the Montgomery family was hemorrhaging. Patricia noticed the audience a moment after I did. She looked past her furious, hyperventilating daughter and made direct eye contact with a woman she had co-chaired a charity gala with just last month. The woman did not offer a sympathetic smile. She did not mouth words of comfort. She simply averted her gaze, picking up her wine glass and turning her back completely. It was the ultimate unspoken excommunication. Patricia let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, clutching her chest as the absolute finality of her social death set in. She was no longer the wealthy, benevolent matriarch. She was a known embezzler, a terrible mother, and a public spectacle. In less than an hour, the Montgomery name had been permanently downgraded from a pillar of the community to a toxic cautionary tale. Brittany finally reached the absolute limit of her shallow emotional capacity. Realizing no one was coming to rescue her, she grabbed her designer coat off the back of the velvet chair and stormed away from the table. She did not check on her mother. She did not look at her defeated father or her humiliated husband. She simply fled the restaurant, pushing past the maitre d' and disappearing into the cold Chicago night to face her impending foreclosure alone. Jamal sat entirely paralyzed for another few seconds before he too stood up. He kept his head bowed, avoiding eye contact with everyone, and shuffled toward the exit like a condemned man walking to the gallows. The rats had officially abandoned the sinking ship. That left only Richard. He sat alone on his side of the massive ruined dining table. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, draping over a man who had rapidly deflated under the crushing pressure of undeniable defeat. His company was gone, his fleet was gone, his carefully crafted legacy was legally owned by the very daughter he had summoned here to discard. I watched his chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow breaths. He was 60 years old. He had no cash reserves, no operational business, and a mountain of toxic debt that I now controlled. The reality of his impending personal bankruptcy and potential federal indictment was suffocating him. Then the unthinkable happened. Richard Montgomery, the arrogant corporate patriarch who had spent 28 years demanding my gratitude and enforcing his absolute authority, pushed his chair back. His legs were shaking so violently they could barely support his weight. He did not stand up to yell or threaten me again. Instead, his knees buckled. Right there in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant, in full view of his wealthy peers and business associates, Richard dropped to his knees onto the hardwood floor. The loud thud of his knees hitting the ground sent a fresh wave of shocked whispers rippling through the dining room. Patricia covered her face, unable to watch her husband surrender his final shred of dignity. Nathaniel remained completely motionless beside me, his expression an impenetrable fortress of old money stoicism. Cameron, please. Richard croaked his voice, a pathetic trembling shadow of its former self. He reached out his shaking hands, gripping the very edge of the white tablecloth, desperate for any anchor. You cannot do this to me. I am 60 years old. If you take everything I have, absolutely nothing left. I will be bankrupt. I will lose the house. I will lose my pension. Please, I am begging you. I looked down at the man who had ordered me to sign severance papers less than an hour ago. He was weeping. Real desperate tears streamed down his flushed, aging face. Just leave me a minority stake, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking loudly. Just 10%, 5%, just enough so I can cash out and survive. You are a brilliant businesswoman, Cameron. You proved it tonight. You won. You beat me completely. I admit it. But you do not have to leave me destitute. I raised you. I gave you my name. We are still family. Deep down you know we are still family. Please show some mercy. He was grasping at the very concept of family he had just tried to legally sever. He was leveraging the word he had used as a weapon against me for nearly 3 decades, hoping it would miraculously act as a shield. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes wide and bloodshot, stripped of every single defense mechanism he had ever possessed. He was not a chief executive officer anymore. He was just a terrified, broken old man begging for financial scraps from the daughter he had chronically starved of affection. I sat perfectly still, observing his public humiliation with absolute clinical detachment. I did not feel a sudden surge of guilt. I did not feel the urge to reach down and help him off the floor. I watched him weep, analyzing his pathetic display of surrender with the exact same ruthless precision I used to audit his fraudulent ledgers. I felt nothing but absolute cold validation. The arrogant man who had relentlessly demanded my unconditional surrender was now permanently and irreversibly broken right down at my very own feet. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the hardwood floor of the restaurant. He was clutching the edge of the tablecloth, waiting for a shred of empathy, hoping that my humanity would override his decades of abuse. He wanted me to remember the scarce, hollow moments where he played the role of a father and ignore the mountainous evidence of his systematic cruelty. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. Richard I began, my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to strain to hear me over his own frantic breathing. I remember my 16th birthday clearly. I came into your home office holding my high school report card. I had achieved straight A's, joined 3 honor societies, and secured an internship at a local accounting firm. I thought naively that academic excellence might finally earn your respect. Do you remember what you said to me? Richard blinked, tears blurring his vision. He shook his head frantically, unable to recall a single interaction where I was the primary focus of his attention. I leaned forward, my gaze boring directly into his terrified eyes. You didn't even look up from your spreadsheet. You told me that good grades don't matter when you come from bad genetics. You said I was a charity case who would never truly understand how the world operates because I lacked the inherent killer instinct of the Montgomery bloodline. You told me I was essentially worthless in the corporate arena and that I should just find a quiet administrative job where I couldn't do any damage to the family reputation. I paused, letting the memory of his arrogance wash over him. Then my voice hardened into cold steel. You taught me a very important lesson that day, Richard. You taught me that business is utterly cutthroat. You taught me that leverage is the only currency that matters and that weakness is a fatal disease to be eradicated. I am just applying your lesson. Richard let out a hollow, desperate sob. Please, Cameron. That was a lifetime ago. I was stressed. The company was struggling. I shook my head, shutting down his pathetic attempt at rewriting history. The company was struggling because you were an incompetent executive, and instead of fixing it, you stole my future to cover your tracks. You embezzled a massive trust fund, funded your biological daughter's exorbitant lifestyle, and let your unqualified son-in-law bleed your operations dry. And when you finally ran out of stolen cash, you brought me to an expensive dinner to legally sever me from your family, fully intending to leave me with absolutely nothing. I stood up slowly, towering over him, asserting absolute dominance over the man who had tried to crush my spirit for nearly 3 decades. You wanted me to understand how the real world operates. Well, this is it. This is a hostile corporate takeover. I have acquired your toxic debt, I control your voting shares, and I am liquidating your pathetic excuse for a legacy. I am not leaving you a 5% minority stake because you are a liability. You have zero operational value, and I do not keep dead weight on my balance sheet. I stepped back, physically separating myself from his groveling display. I offered absolutely no empathy. I offered no second chances. The surgical strike was complete, and the infection was entirely removed. How could you? Patricia whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread of sound. She was still sitting in the velvet booth, her face buried in her hands, her elite social standing permanently annihilated. How could you be so cold? I turned my icy gaze toward her. I am exactly the woman you forged me to be, Patricia. You spent 28 years ensuring I knew I was an outsider, a transaction, a highly profitable tax write-off. You treated my life like a balance sheet, weighing the cost of feeding me against the social capital you gained by parading me around your charity galas. You intercepted my trust fund, forged my signature, and funded your actual daughter's fairy tale while forcing me into massive debt. You don't get to demand warmth from the daughter you systematically starved of affection. Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence a towering wall of silent generational power. He looked down at Richard, his expression reflecting absolute disgust. The Kensington family spent decades searching for Cameron Nathaniel, stated his voice a low, commanding rumble. We found her, and we provided for her, trusting that the people raising her possessed basic human decency. Instead, we found a family of opportunistic parasites. You are incredibly fortunate my sister is handling this through a corporate acquisition rather than allowing me to dismantle your lives personally. Richard shrank under Nathaniel's gaze, releasing his grip on the tablecloth and slumping completely onto the floor. The fight was utterly drained from him. The blustering CEO, the arrogant country club patriarch, was gone. He was just a bankrupt, broken criminal waiting for the federal authorities to collect him. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out one final document. It wasn't a corporate takeover filing or a bank statement. It was a formal settlement agreement drafted by the finest corporate litigators in Chicago, designed to legally bind the Montgomery family to the absolute consequences of their actions. I dropped the heavy packet onto the table right next to the spilled wine and the original severance papers they had so arrogantly tried to force upon me. This is your only way out of a federal penitentiary, I announced, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. The terms are non-negotiable. I am giving you a very brief window to secure your freedom, but the cost will be absolutely everything you have left. I tapped my index finger against the thick settlement agreement resting on the ruined tablecloth. I told Richard to get off the floor and sit in his chair like a man making the final corporate transaction of his career. He scrambled up his hands, shaking so violently he could barely pull himself into the velvet booth. Patricia stared at the legal document as if it were an execution order. I began reading the terms aloud, my voice maintaining the icy, detached cadence of a corporate liquidator. I explained that the $3 million they systematically stole from my Kensington Trust Fund had accrued substantial market interest over the last 5 years. However, I told them I was willing to waive the interest and punitive damages in exchange for a complete voluntary surrender of their remaining physical and liquid assets. I opened to the first page and pointed to the primary stipulations. In exchange for not handing my comprehensive forensic binder over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Richard and Patricia Montgomery would sign over the deed to their sprawling 7-bedroom primary estate in the exclusive northern suburbs. I clarified that this transfer of real property was absolute and immediate. They would have exactly 48 hours to collect their personal clothing and vacate the premises before my private security contractors changed the locks and secured the perimeter of my new property. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless cry, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. "You are taking our home," she gasped, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her sudden impending homelessness. "We have lived there for 20 years. Where are we supposed to go? I did not blink. I continued reading down the strict list of demands. Next, they were required to execute an immediate, irrevocable transfer of all their remaining liquid assets. Every single personal checking account, high-yield savings account, and domestic mutual fund that had not already been completely drained by Richard's failing logistics company would be legally seized to satisfy their massive debt to me. I told them they were relinquishing every last penny of their retirement safety net. Finally, I moved to the vehicle clause. I stated that all luxury vehicles currently registered under their personal names or purchased using funds siphoned from the corporate shadow accounts were to be surrendered by noon tomorrow. This included Patricia's imported luxury SUV and Richard's vintage sports car. I told them that their days of driving European imports bought with my stolen money were permanently over. Richard stared at the list of assets being brutally ripped from his grasp. He looked at the settlement agreement, his eyes scanning the dense legal text that effectively erased his entire financial identity. "You are leaving us completely destitute," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "You are stripping us down to absolute zero. We will have to rely on government food assistance." I leaned across the table, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. I told him that relying on public assistance is exactly what they had originally planned for me tonight. They brought me to this restaurant to force me to sign away my legal rights, fully expecting me to walk out into the cold Chicago night with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. I was simply returning the favor, executing their own malicious business strategy with infinitely more competence. I pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and placed it precisely in the center of the settlement agreement. I looked at Richard, then at Patricia, making sure they understood the absolute finality of this moment. "This is the choice," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying clarity. "You pick up that pen, you sign over everything to repay your massive fraudulent debt, and you walk away tonight with nothing but your physical freedom. You walk out of this restaurant as bankrupt, broken individuals, but you get to sleep in a bed instead of a cold jail cell." I paused, letting the alternative scenario hang heavily over the dining table. "Refuse to sign." I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, dangerous whisper, and I pick up my phone. I hand this entire forensic binder, complete with your forged signatures, your shadow banking records, and Jamal's catastrophic operational audits, directly to the white-collar crime division of the FBI for wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. I will personally ensure that the federal prosecutors pursue the maximum mandatory minimum sentences. You will spend the rest of your natural lives rotting in a federal penitentiary, and the government will seize all your assets anyway under civil forfeiture laws. I lifted my wrist, pulling back the cuff of my jacket to expose the face of my watch. The second hand was sweeping relentlessly across the dial. "You have exactly 60 seconds to decide," I announced, my voice cutting off any further debate or pathetic pleas for mercy. 60 seconds to choose between utter financial ruin or spending your retirement behind bars. The countdown began. I watched the second hand tick. 1, 2, 3. The silence at the table was deafening, broken only by the sound of Patricia's frantic, hyperventilating breaths. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to find a loophole. But Richard was completely out of maneuvers. He was staring at the silver pen as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. 10 seconds, I called out, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Richard's hands were shaking violently. He looked at Nathaniel, who stood behind me like a towering silent enforcer of absolute justice. There was no salvation coming from the Kensington Empire. 20 seconds, I announced, keeping my gaze fixed on the sweeping dial of my watch. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing Richard's forearm with a desperate, clawing grip. "Richard, you have to sign it!" she hissed, her voice panicked and shrill. "We cannot go to federal prison. We would never survive it. You have to sign the papers right now. Do it." 30 seconds. I stated, the rhythmic ticking of the watch amplifying the suffocating pressure in the room. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of ultimate defeat rolling down his flushed, aging cheek. He was finally confronting the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless arrogance. The empire he had built on theft, fraud, and the emotional abuse of an adopted child had been completely dismantled. He opened his eyes, realizing he was entirely out of time and out of leverage. 40 seconds, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. I am pulling up the contact profile for the federal authorities. Richard let out a broken, agonizing sob. His hand shot out across the table. He lunged for the silver pen. His fingers grasped the sleek metal barrel of the pen with the desperate, white-knuckled grip of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Sweat poured down Richard's forehead, stinging his eyes and dripping onto the starched white collar of his expensive dress shirt. He did not bother to read the fine print. He did not attempt to negotiate a single-clause ask for a minor concession regarding his personal retirement accounts or beg for a grace period to vacate the premises. The blustering corporate titan had been completely hollowed out, leaving nothing but a terrified, compliant shell of a man. With a violent, jerky motion, he pressed the nib of the pen against the signature line of the settlement agreement. The ink flowed dark and permanent across the heavy parchment paper. He signed away his logistics company. He signed away his sprawling estate in the northern suburbs. He signed away his luxury vehicles, his offshore holding accounts, and every last cent of his liquid capital. He signed away his entire carefully fabricated identity. When he finished initialing the final page of the grueling document, the pen slipped from his slick, trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the ruined tablecloth. He slumped backward into the velvet booth, staring blankly at the ornate vaulted ceiling of the restaurant, his chest heave with dry, silent sobs. The arrogant patriarch was officially dead buried under a mountain of his own financial sins. While Richard finalized his own financial execution, the secondary casualties of the Montgomery Empire were actively destroying whatever remained of their own pathetic lives. Brittany sat paralyzed in her chair, watching her invincible father sign away the very foundation of her unearned privilege. A high-pitched, continuous wail tore from her throat, a sound of pure, selfish mourning for her lost shopping sprees and luxury vacations. She turned her tear-streaked, panicked face toward her husband, desperately reaching out to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit. She begged Jamal to do something to intervene to deploy his supposed business acumen to save her from the impending reality of a working-class existence. Jamal recoiled from her touch as if she were highly infectious. He looked at his weeping wife, then at the catastrophic smoking ruins of his father-in-law, and made his final cowardly calculation. There was no stolen money left to embezzle, no prestige left to borrow, and no corporate ladder left to climb. He snatched his cashmere coat from the back of his chair and turned his back on his marriage. Brittany screamed his name, begging him not to leave her alone with her destitute, disgraced parents. Jamal did not even pause. He stormed out of the private dining room, pushing aggressively past the waitstaff, leaving his car keys, his fraudulent career, and his wife behind in a desperate bid to escape the federal blast radius. Their marriage was officially terminated instantly by the sudden, brutal absence of stolen cash. I slid the heavy legal packet across the table, positioning it directly in front of Patricia. I picked up the silver fountain pen, wiped the barrel clean with a pristine linen napkin, and offered it to her. It was her turn to surrender her crown. Patricia stared at the document, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The signature lines demanded she relinquish the deed to the suburban mansion where she had hosted countless high society galas, the very home she used to assert dominance over her peers. It demanded the keys to the imported SUV she used to flaunt her fake wealth at the exclusive country club. It demanded the complete, unconditional liquidation of her carefully curated, entirely fraudulent life. Her heavily manicured hands shook so violently she could barely lift them from her lap. She looked around the restaurant, realizing that the elite patrons she so desperately wanted to impress were watching her complete and utter degradation in real time. There was no social grace left to save her. There was no charm manipulation or fake philanthropic smile that could alter the terms of this ironclad contract. I kept my gaze locked on her, exerting silent, crushing pressure. I reminded her that the 60-second clock had technically expired, but I was willing to accept her signature right now to prevent an immediate call to the federal authorities. I told her that hesitation would cost her the only thing she had left, which was her physical freedom outside of a prison cell. Patricia slowly reached out and took the pen from my hand. Her meticulously applied makeup was completely ruined, tracking dark, jagged lines of expensive mascara down her pale, aging cheeks. She pressed the pen to the paper. Her signature was a frantic, barely legible scrawl, completely devoid of the elegant, sweeping flourishes she usually employed when signing charity checks with my stolen money. Every stroke of the pen stripped away another layer of her artificial superiority. She was signing her own financial death warrant, condemning herself to a life of stark, terrifying poverty and public disgrace. When she finished the last required document, she dropped the pen, as if the metal had severely burned her skin. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a toxic, volatile mixture of absolute defeat and venomous hatred. She leaned forward, her voice a fragile, broken hiss that barely carried across the ruined dining table. "You are a monster," Patricia whispered, her words dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "You destroyed your own family tonight. You are a cold, heartless monster." I calmly reached across the table and collected the signed settlement agreements, tapping the edges perfectly straight, with professional precision. I looked directly into the hollow, terrified eyes of the woman who had abused, neglected, and exploited me for nearly 3 decades. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face, allowing the absolute victory to settle into my bones. "No," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute devastating power. "I am a Kensington." I smoothly slid the stack of freshly signed contracts into the sleek interior of my structured leather tote bag. The satisfying zip of the golden hardware sealing the compartment sounded exactly like a heavy prison door locking shut. Those few sheets of paper represented the complete and total transfer of the Montgomery Empire into my absolute control. I had successfully secured my stolen inheritance, liquidated their fraudulent assets, and orchestrated the most ruthless hostile takeover in the history of my firm. Richard remained slumped in the crushed velvet booth, staring blankly at the empty space on the tablecloth where his entire net worth had just evaporated. Patricia was shivering violently, her expensive designer dress suddenly looking like a cheap, ill-fitting costume on a broken, terrified woman. Brittany had already fled the scene, abandoning her parents to face the impending financial ruin entirely alone. The magnificent illusion they had meticulously crafted for 28 years was now nothing more than a pile of toxic, smoking rubble. I adjusted the strap of my bag over my shoulder, feeling the comforting, heavy weight of absolute victory. I did not rush my departure. I deliberately allowed them to sit in the suffocating silence, forcing them to absorb the devastating reality of their new, impoverished existence. The power dynamic in the private dining room was permanently cemented. I was the undisputed victor, and they were the utterly vanquished. The nervous waiter, who had been hovering near the entrance of the private room, finally gathered enough courage to approach our table. He kept his eyes averted, clearly terrified of interrupting the catastrophic family implosion that had captivated the entire restaurant. He stood awkwardly next to the leather folder containing the $4,250 dinner check. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out my sleek, minimalist wallet. I bypassed the black titanium corporate cards and withdrew a single crisp $100 bill. I held it between my index and middle fingers, making sure the Montgomerys saw the physical cash they so desperately lacked. I dropped the $100 bill directly onto the center of the ruined white tablecloth, right next to the puddle of spilled vintage Cabernet. The bright green currency contrasted sharply against the dark red stain. I looked directly at the trembling waiter and offered him a polite, professional smile. "That is for your excellent service tonight," I told him, ensuring my voice carried across the silent dining room. I then shifted my icy gaze back to my adoptive parents. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the heavy leather folder resting on Richard's lap. "The rest of that massive bill is entirely on you." I watched the fresh wave of panic hit Patricia as she realized her corporate credit cards were frozen and her personal accounts were legally seized. They were sitting in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago with a massive tab and absolutely zero means to pay it. Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate plea for a financial bailout. He opened his mouth, likely to beg me to cover the check to save him from the ultimate societal humiliation of washing dishes in a tuxedo, but I raised my hand to silence him immediately. I was not going to spare them a single ounce of embarrassment. They had intentionally brought me to this restaurant to humiliate me and discard me like garbage. It was only fitting that they would be the ones escorted out by police or security when their payment methods inevitably declined. I looked down at the broken, weeping people who had spent my entire childhood demanding my unconditional gratitude for their bare minimum efforts. I let the silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds, ensuring they felt the absolute crushing weight of their complete isolation from polite society. "Oh," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "And by the way, you are no longer my family. You lost that privilege the moment you decided my existence was nothing more than a profitable tax write-off. I am completely and permanently erasing you from my life. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my office. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. If I even see you walking down the same side of the street as me, I will have my security team physically remove you. We are officially done." I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left for them to say that I cared to hear. I turned my back on the Montgomery family, pivoting on my designer heels with flawless, undeniable authority. Nathaniel Kensington stood ready, offering his arm, with the effortless grace of a man who possessed true generational power. I looped my hand through his arm, feeling the solid, grounding presence of my actual bloodline for the very first time. Together, we walked away from the ruined table, our footsteps echoing in perfect unison against the polished hardwood floor. The elite patrons of Le Petit parted like the Red Sea as we navigated through the main dining room. The wealthy socialites and powerful executives stared at us in absolute stunned silence, their eyes tracking the victors of the most brutal corporate execution they had ever witnessed. I kept my head held high, radiating absolute confidence and total victory. I did not look back. I did not cast a single glance over my shoulder to see Richard weeping or Patricia shivering in the wreckage of her fake empire. We reached the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp, cool Chicago night. The freezing air rushed over my face, carrying the undeniable, intoxicating scent of pure freedom. The heavy chains of conditional love and toxic obligation had been permanently shattered. I was finally truly free. 6 months have passed since that freezing Chicago night when I walked out of the restaurant and left the Montgomery family to suffocate in the catastrophic wreckage of their own making. The passage of time has not dulled the absolute satisfaction of my victory. It has only sharpened it. I sit behind a massive custom-cut obsidian desk in my corner glass office on the 54th floor of the Kensington Private Equity headquarters. The room is a testament to unyielding corporate power, furnished with imported leather seating, minimalist modern art, and expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a commanding, uninterrupted view of the entire city. It is a space designed for executives who move markets and dismantle empires. It is exactly where I belong. I spent the first 90 days following the restaurant confrontation completely gutting Montgomery logistics. I fired the bloated, incompetent management team, liquidated their useless physical assets, and restructured the entire supply chain operation from the ground up. The company is now a highly profitable, ruthlessly efficient subsidiary operating seamlessly under my direct control. The Montgomery name has been legally scrubbed from the building facade, replaced by a sleek, modern corporate identity that bears absolutely no trace of the fraudulent, arrogant man who originally built it. I reach out and tap the trackpad of my laptop, waking the high-resolution screen. A new encrypted email sits at the very top of my inbox, sent directly from my lead private investigator. The subject line simply reads, "Final status update." I take a slow, appreciative sip of my artisan black coffee and click open the message. It details the complete, undeniable, and permanent fallout of my former adoptive family. The legal and financial dominoes fell exactly as I mathematically predicted they would. Richard Montgomery officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 3 months ago. His desperate, pathetic attempts to hide a few remaining liquid assets were immediately flagged by the federal bankruptcy trustee, entirely thanks to the comprehensive forensic audit I provided to the authorities. Stripped of his sprawling suburban estate, his leased luxury cars, and his stolen corporate pension, the former king of logistics is now working as a shift supervisor at a big box retail hardware store in the deep, undesirable suburbs. The arrogant man who used to terrorize warehouse employees from the comfort of an expensive leather chair now spends his exhausting days wearing a cheap synthetic vest. He answers to regional managers half his age and sweeps the dusty retail aisles for minimum wage. Patricia is living in a cramped, poorly insulated two-room apartment on the unfashionable, neglected side of the city. Her elite country club membership was publicly revoked due to months of unpaid dues, and her wealthy socialite friends abandoned her the exact second the embezzlement rumors were confirmed by the local financial press. She spends her days entirely isolated, surrounded by a few remaining cheap knockoff handbags, bitterly clinging to the ghost of a high society reputation that will never ever return. The woman who valued public image above human life is now completely invisible to the society she once desperately tried to rule. The email moves on to the spectacular implosion of the biological golden child. Brittany and Jamal's fragile marriage did not survive the freezing of their corporate credit cards. Within 2 weeks of their financial amputation, they filed for a highly contested, viciously public divorce. Without the stolen trust fund money masking their mutual incompetence and shallow personalities, they turned on each other like starving animals fighting over a scrap of meat. Jamal attempted to hide his remaining personal assets, but the massive crushing debt incurred during their lavish lifestyle consumed absolutely everything they owned. Their suburban mansion was aggressively foreclosed on by the bank, forcing a humiliating public auction of their belongings. Brittany is currently drowning in staggering legal fees and astronomical credit card debt. She has been forced to work a grueling commission-based retail job at a local shopping mall just to afford her basic living expenses and cheap groceries. The girl who once giggled at the prospect of me taking a bus is now navigating the public transit system herself, clutching a worn-out purse and dodging collection agency phone calls. Jamal vanished into absolute obscurity. He was effectively blacklisted from the entire corporate sector after my forensic audit exposed his catastrophic operational failures to every major executive recruiting firm in the Midwest. He is entirely unemployable in any meaningful capacity. I close the laptop screen with a soft, satisfying click. There is no lingering guilt in my chest. There is no trace of remorse for the absolute devastation I engineered. I did not ruin their lives. I simply handed them the mirror and forced them to look at their own hideous reflections. They built their entire existence on theft, emotional abuse, and extreme unearned arrogance. I just removed the stolen foundation and let gravity do the rest of the heavy lifting. The heavy glass door of my office swings open quietly. Nathaniel walks in, bypassing my executive assistant with the effortless, commanding ease of a man who owns the entire building. He is wearing a flawless navy suit, carrying 2 fresh cups of espresso. He walks across the plush carpet and sets one of the cups squarely on my obsidian desk. We do not need to exchange dramatic emotional greetings or engage in pointless small talk. The bond between us is forged in mutual respect, shared ambition, and the undeniable, unbreakable strength of our actual bloodline. Nathaniel turns and walks over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. The city pulses with vibrant energy, a vast, complex network of wealth power and endless corporate opportunity. I stand up from my ergonomic chair, picking up my espresso, and join my brother at the glass. We stand shoulder to shoulder, overlooking the massive empire we collectively control. I look down at the bustling streets far below us. Somewhere down there, Richard is clocking in for a miserable retail shift. Patricia is staring blankly at the peeling paint on her apartment walls. Brittany is scanning barcodes for minimum wage. They are permanently trapped in the grueling, suffocating reality they so desperately tried to force upon me. Meanwhile, I am standing at the absolute pinnacle of the financial world, surrounded by authentic family, infinite resources, and unquestionable authority. The hostile takeover is permanently finalized. I take a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, perfectly conditioned air of my executive suite. It is the undeniable scent of complete financial, emotional, and psychological victory.